At dawn, the Anatolian plateau lies quiet, a land of pale gold and drifting dust. The wind moves across the plain like the breath of something ancient, whispering over dry grasses and forgotten stones. On the horizon, a hill rises from the earth, round and smooth, its summit barren. The locals call it Göbekli Tepe, the pot-bellied hill. But beneath that simple name lies a paradox that should not exist. 12,000 years ago, when the world was still shaking off the last of its ice, this hill was already sacred. Long before Egypt, before Sumer, before even the first grain was planted, people gathered here and carved their gods into stone. They had no pottery, no wheels, no writing, yet they raised megaliths as tall as trees and etched them with beasts from a dream. When the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt first climbed this ridge in 1994, he saw nothing more than a field of limestone fragments glinting under the sun. Farmers from the nearby village had turned up strange pillars while ploughing, but no one thought them important. Some were dragged to the local museum, labelled Byzantine and forgotten. Yet to Schmidt, they looked familiar, the same kind of pillars he had seen at a submerged Neolithic site called Neveli Chori, far to the north. He ordered a small test trench. Within hours, the spade struck something smooth and curved, a carved stone, its surface bearing the faint outline of a vulture. Then another emerged, then a third. It was as if the hill itself was exhaling its memories. Schmidt understood in that moment. This mound was not natural. It was a man-made mountain, a temple buried under its own dust. When the first aerial photographs were taken, the magnitude of the site stunned the world. Dozens of circular enclosures radiated from the centre of the hill, some more than 20 metres wide. In each, two massive T-shaped pillars stood at the core like sentinels, surrounded by smaller stones arranged in perfect symmetry. Many weighed more than 10 tons. Their surfaces were alive with carvings, snakes, foxes, cranes, lions, boars. An entire ecosystem turned into myth. What shocked archaeologists most was the age. Radiocarbon analysis from surrounding sediments placed the earliest layers at around 9,600 BC, over 7,000 years before Stonehenge. This meant Göbekli Tepe was built by people who, by all conventional timelines, should have been incapable of such achievement. They were hunter-gatherers, yet they were architects. The paradox rippled through the academic world. Civilization, we had believed, began with farming, the surplus that allowed cities, temples, and priests to appear. But here was a temple older than agriculture itself. Did belief come first, calling people to settle? Did worship give birth to civilization? In his notes, Schmidt wrote something that reads almost like a confession. First came the temple, then the city. He would spend the rest of his life defending that idea, that religion, not necessity, united humanity. For if the hunters of Göbekli Tepe could build such a sanctuary, then our story does not begin with survival, but with reverence. And yet the more he dug, the stranger it became. There were no hearths, no trash pits, no sign of homes. It was as if no one ever lived here, only gathered, worked, feasted, and left. A sanctuary on the edge of the world. Under the microscope of excavation, the hill revealed its layers like pages of an ancient book. Each enclosure, once used, was deliberately filled with rubble, and another was built atop it. The people who raised these pillars seem to have buried their own creation, perhaps to preserve it, perhaps to end it. Beneath his boots, Schmidt was walking, not on the remains of a city, but on the intentional burial of belief. From the top of Göbekli Tepe, you can see the entire plain of Harran stretching south toward Mesopotamia, the future cradle of kings and gods. But in 10,000 BC, it was a wilderness of gazelle and wild grain, a green horizon after the Ice Age. The air was different then, heavy with pollen, full of migration and new beginnings. Somewhere among those shifting valleys, a band of nomads must have stood gazing up at this hill, sensing something sacred about its shape. Maybe they dreamed of spirits in the stones or ancestors sleeping beneath. Whatever vision moved them, it compelled them to carve order into chaos, to make the first architecture of faith. When Schmidt brushed the dust from the face of the central pillars, he noticed something that made him pause. Arms and hands carved along their sides, folded in front of them like guardians in prayer. These were not just pillars, they were beings. Anthropomorphic, upright, watching. He called them the first gods of humankind. But who carved them? And why did they bury their own sanctuary? Was this the birthplace of myth, or a tomb built for it? The sun slides low over the Anatolian horizon, painting the stones gold. The hill stands silent, its secrets half revealed, half forgotten. From a distance it looks almost natural again, as if the earth has chosen to reclaim the memory of its builders. In that silence, one question remains. If civilization began here, what world ended before it? Before you move on to the next chapter, take a moment to help this story reach more people. Like this video if it made you wonder, and subscribe if you want to keep exploring the forgotten worlds that hide beneath our own. Leave a comment below and tell us what you think happened here 12,000 years ago. Your thoughts and theories are what keep these mysteries alive. Long before Klaus Schmidt ever set foot on the hill of Göbekli Tepe, the land itself was already speaking, softly, in a language of buried ruins. The southeastern plains of Turkey have always been restless ground. Rivers shift their courses here, valleys drown, dry, and drown again. Every few centuries the earth seems to erase itself, and with it, the memory of those who once lived upon it. In the mid-20th century, a different kind of flood was coming, not from nature, but from human ambition. Turkey's new dam projects along the Euphrates were designed to transform the arid southeast into farmland. But to archaeologists, those reservoirs were death sentences for entire landscapes of history. Before the waters rose, hurried excavations swept through the region, salvage digs, last chances to document what would soon vanish beneath the reservoirs. Among the archaeologists was Robert Braidwood, a pioneer in Near Eastern prehistory. In the 1960s, his team uncovered a site called Sayonu, revealing people who lived more than 10,000 years ago, already building rectangular houses, experimenting with grain. The discovery pushed back the dawn of agriculture, but it also left a question hanging. What came before these farmers? Just upriver lay another small settlement, Nevali Chori, explored in the 1980s by German and Turkish researchers. There they found something strange. T-shaped limestone pillars embedded in the floors of mud brick houses, their surfaces carved with snakes, birds, and abstract hands. It was a whisper of something far older, a prototype of meaning without precedent. Then the Ataturk Dam closed, and the valley filled. Nevali Chori disappeared beneath the new lake. All that remained were field notes, photographs, and a handful of pillars stored in the Schönlöfer Museum. For nearly a decade, those pillars stood forgotten in a dim storage hall, mislabeled curiosities from a site no one could visit anymore. But in the mid-1990s, a quiet chain of accidents began to reconnect the story. One afternoon, a visiting German archaeologist noticed two unusual statues in the museum's storeroom, their bodies stylized, reptilian, unlike anything from later civilizations. He asked where they had come from. A curator shrugged. From a place near Urfa, a hill called Göbekli Tepe. That archaeologist was Klaus Schmidt. He had spent years studying the buried ruins of Nevali Chori, the very site now underwater. When he saw those statues, recognition flickered. The style, the limestone, the posture, they were the same hands, the same silent forms. A week later, he was climbing the unnamed hill northeast of the city, where farmers had been ploughing up bits of flint and carved stone. It wasn't much to look at. Low scrub, stony soil, a mulberry tree standing sentinel at the crest. But as Schmidt walked the slope, he realized the ground itself was artificial, a mound built layer upon layer. The whispers from Navali Kori had found their echo. Only now do we understand what this meant. The same hands that built the sunken sanctuaries now lost beneath water had ancestors scattered across the entire region. A chain of sacred hills, each marking a chapter in a story that had nearly been erased. Archaeologists today call it the Tashella culture, the Stone Hills, a network of sites stretching across the Harran Plain. Göbekli Tepe is simply the one that survived. Every discovery around it, Karahan Tepe, Seyfa Tepe, Göbekli Tepe, adds another voice to the chorus. Together they reveal a civilization without cities, a people who built monuments instead of houses. It's easy to imagine Schmidt's realization that first evening on the hill. If Navali Kori had whispered, Göbekli Tepe was shouting. What had been submerged was now resurfacing, the same culture rising again, like a tide of memory reclaiming the shore. Perhaps that is how knowledge truly survives. Not through uninterrupted record, but through echoes, fragments that vanish and reappear, carried by those who still listen. And as Schmidt stood on that hill, brushing dust from the first carved stone, he could feel the silence beneath his feet changing tone, the deep, slow rhythm of something ancient awakening. The floods had buried the first temples, yes, but the earth had kept their voices, and now at last the stones were ready to speak again. When the sun rises over the Anatolian plain, Göbekli Tepe appears as a wound in the earth, concentric scars carved into the limestone like ripples left by a vanished thought. From above, the pattern seems deliberate, circles within circles, each one mirroring the next, as if the builders were imitating a geometry they saw in the stars. Yet what lay around it was emptiness. No village, no river, no hearths or walls of clay. It was as though the temple had been raised in the middle of nowhere, a monument without a city, built by people who had not yet learned to stay. In the early years of excavation, archaeologists expected to find evidence of permanent habitation, pottery shards, domestic waste, the usual signatures of a village. Instead, they found none. The bones of wild gazelle and boar were everywhere, but no trace of penned animals. Grains of wild barley and wheat, but no stored harvest. There were no houses, no ovens, not even a single clay pot. The evidence was undeniable. Göbekli Tepe's builders were hunter-gatherers, not farmers, and yet they carved and moved stones weighing 10, sometimes 20 tons, using only flint tools and sheer coordination. Each enclosure, roughly 20 meters across, was formed by a ring of smaller T-shaped pillars surrounding two colossal central ones. The tallest stood over 5 meters high. The craftsmanship was astonishing, perfectly balanced, aligned with cardinal directions, their faces oriented inward as if attending a ritual. The smaller stones seemed to watch the larger pair, an audience before a stage. On the surfaces, the animals came alive, foxes with bared teeth, scorpions crawling toward the base, vultures stretching their wings. There were no depictions of gods, only creatures. But the arrangement itself felt divine. Klaus Schmidt began to suspect something revolutionary. These pillars, he wrote, were not idols of gods, they were the gods. The T-shape, with arms carved along the sides and hands meeting in front, represented stylized human figures, perhaps ancestors, perhaps divine beings. They were the guardians of memory, frozen mid-prayer. Each enclosure seemed to tell a different story. In one, vultures circled human heads, symbols of death and rebirth. In another, boars and snakes faced one another in tension, perhaps embodying night and day, life and decay. But all were bound by a shared artistic grammar, repetition, symmetry, purpose. The deeper they dug, the older the enclosures became. The largest, most intricate ones lay deepest in the hill, dating to around 9,600 BC. Above them, newer layers appeared simpler, smaller, as if the culture had regressed rather than advanced. It was an archaeological inversion of time, the past more sophisticated than the future. That alone broke every rule of progress. How could hunter-gatherers organize labor on such a scale? Schmidt estimated that building a single enclosure might have required at least 500 workers, months of effort, and a shared vision that transcended clan and season. There were no beasts of burden, no wheels, no metal, only coordination, patience and belief. This was not mere survival, it was devotion. The limestone was quarried nearby, visible scars still marking the bedrock. Pillars were shaped with stone hammers, then dragged uphill on sledges and ropes of woven reed. Some were left half-carved in the quarry as if the work had stopped suddenly. Tools abandoned mid-strike. Their unfinished forms lie there still, waiting for hands that never returned. The closer the team studied the geometry of the enclosures, the more it resembled a language, a system of repetition and correspondence. Pillars in different circles shared near-identical proportions. Some faced astronomical alignments, perhaps solstices, perhaps constellations now forgotten. The same motifs appeared again and again: foxes, snakes, cranes. Not decoration, communication. Göbekli Tepe may have been a network of stories carved in stone, each ring a verse in a long poem about creation. If that is true, then the builders were not primitive at all. They were storytellers who had traded words for symbols, poets of stone, composing the world's first mythology. Schmidt often walked the site alone at twilight, when the sandstone glowed like amber and the wind whistled through the half-buried walls. He once wrote, "They built for gods who had no names, and in doing so they built us." It is possible that the site served as a gathering place for many groups, hunter bands from the surrounding plains, meeting seasonally to celebrate feasts, marriages, or rites of passage. The carvings may have represented their totems, their clans, their stories of origin. But if this was true, then Göbekli Tepe was more than a temple. It was a social machine, one that united scattered tribes into a shared purpose. The act of construction itself may have been ritual, the coordination of labor transforming chaos into order. In that sense, civilization did not begin with walls or kings. It began with collaboration. When visitors stand today inside the great circular pit of Enclosure D, the oldest and best preserved, they often fall silent. The central pillars loom like figures from another world, their faceless heads tilted slightly upward as if listening. Between them, the floor is smooth and pale, made of polished lime, still bearing the marks of tools that scraped it 12,000 years ago. If you listen closely, the space has an acoustics of its own. The sound of a voice carries and returns in gentle waves, as though the air remembers. In that echo, you can almost hear them. The builders without cities, calling across millennia through the stones they left behind. They had no palaces, no writing, no gods carved in human likeness, but they had something else, the ability to imagine together. And maybe that, more than farming, metal or kingship, is what civilization truly means. The pillars of Göbekli Tepe still stand, their carvings eroded but defiant, their silence complete. Yet even in that silence, they continue to ask the question carved into their foundations. Why did we begin to build, and for whom? Night at Göbekli Tepe is unlike anywhere else on Earth. The sky feels close enough to touch, a dome of cold light and drifting constellations. From the top of the hill, the stones seem to breathe, their edges faintly glowing beneath the stars. Once, long ago, the same constellations shimmered above these pillars, and the people who gathered here must have looked up, wondering whether those lights were gods or ancestors. In the carvings that cover the stones, an entire world still moves. Serpents twist around each other, cranes step in mirrored rhythm, foxes dart between scorpions, vultures stretch their wings toward unseen heavens. To modern eyes, it may look like chaos, but to the people of 10,000 BC, this was a language. Each creature had meaning. Each gesture carried memory. Archaeologists call it iconography, but what if it was more than that, a lexicon of myth carved in relief? The fox appears more often than any other animal. Its body, lean and cunning, curves along the pillars like a shadow. To Schmidt, the fox might have been a symbol of transformation, a shamanic messenger that crossed between worlds. In the animist imagination, foxes were the boundary walkers, guides through the liminal spaces between life and death. The vulture, too, is everywhere. Wings spread, talons extended. At Navali Chori and Jerf El Amar, the vulture was linked to sky burials, where the dead were left exposed to be carried away by birds. To these early people, vultures did not desecrate the body, they released the soul. The carvings of headless figures beneath vultures might not be macabre, they might depict ascension. Then there are snakes, coiling bands that wrap the pillars, slithering between other animals. In every ancient mythology, the serpent holds the same dual nature: life and death, poison and cure, wisdom and danger. At Göbekli Tepe, it may have symbolized renewal, the shedding of skin, the eternal return. What unites these images is not fear, but reverence. They are not warnings carved in stone, they are prayers. Some researchers suggest that Göbekli Tepe's enclosures form a cosmic map, the walls as horizons, the pillars as celestial markers. The British archaeoastronomer Martin Sweatman has proposed that the animal symbols correspond to star constellations, perhaps recording the sky of 10,950 BC, the very dawn of the Holocene. One pillar, known as the Vulture Stone, Pillar 43, shows a vulture holding a circle over its wing, interpreted by some as a depiction of a comet event that ended the Younger Dryas. If true, it would make Göbekli Tepe not just a temple, but a cosmic archive. Others reject this reading. They argue the imagery is too local, too personal, an ecological mythology reflecting the animals that shared these hills. To them, the pillars are totems, emblems of clans who returned here for seasonal feasts. Each group carved its spirit animal, reaffirming its identity within a larger spiritual order. Perhaps both interpretations are true. Perhaps the people of Göbekli Tepe saw no boundary between the sky above and the world below, between animal and ancestor, earth and heaven. In the flicker of torchlight, the reliefs would have come alive. Shadows dancing across stone snakes, eyes glinting in the dark. The carvings were shallow enough that the play of fire made them move, the illusion of breath in limestone flesh. This was not decoration, it was animation, an early form of storytelling by light and motion. Anthropologists have long observed that when hunter-gatherers gather for ritual, they do not pray to gods above them. They become them. They wear masks, mimic animals, dissolve their identities in trance. The carvings at Göbekli Tepe may have been masks made permanent, their dances frozen in stone. Imagine the sound, the steady beat of wooden drums, the clatter of bone rattles, the hiss of torches. Figures painted in ochre moving in circles around the pillars. The scent of smoke and sweat and wild grain, and at the centre, two towering beings, faceless yet unmistakably human in posture, standing over the gathering like guardians of a truth too ancient for words. They did not build temples to separate themselves from nature. They built them to speak with it. Perhaps that is the secret Göbekli Tepe still holds. the memory of a world where gods were not distant rulers, but reflections of the living earth. Today, under the modern protective canopy that shields the site, the wind still plays through the hollows between pillars. It hums at a low frequency, a resonance that seems almost deliberate. Some visitors claim to feel it in their bones, a vibration like the echo of a forgotten chant. When the sun sets and the last tourists leave, the foxes return, slipping between stones exactly as they did 12 millennia ago. The vultures circle above, waiting. The serpents still move in their hidden paths beneath the soil. The temple has fallen silent, but its prayers continue, carried by the creatures that once inspired them. Recently, deep within one of the buried chambers at Göbekli Tepe, archaeologists uncovered something the site had never revealed before: a human statue carved in limestone over 12,000 years ago. The figure was standing upright, arms pressed against its sides, its expression solemn, almost mournful. Unlike the carved foxes or vultures that cover the pillars, this was unmistakably human. Fragile, deliberate, alive. It was found between enclosures B and D, where two of the great T-pillars face one another like guardians. Some believe the statue was meant to stand between worlds, a mediator between the animal spirits and the emerging human identity. Its face, faintly eroded yet purposeful, bridges the wild and the civilized. This discovery adds a new dimension to Göbekli Tepe's mystery. For decades, scholars thought the builders avoided depicting themselves, choosing instead to worship through symbols of animals and abstract forms. But this statue suggests a shift, a moment when humankind began to insert its own image into the sacred stage. Perhaps this was the first reflection, the moment the hunter saw himself as part of the divine story he had been carving all along. The animals were no longer gods apart from man. They were mirrors, facets of a single consciousness learning to recognize itself. The face of that limestone figure is expressionless, but the silence it carries is profound, as though the first spark of humanity's self-awareness had just been born, and it did not yet know whether to fear or revere what it saw. And so we begin to see Göbekli Tepe not only as the first temple, but as the last memory of a world that believed everything was alive. The next layer of mystery waits beneath those stones, a glimpse of the dead themselves and the rituals that bound them to the living. At dawn, mist gathers in the hollows between the pillars, as if the hill itself exhales what it remembers. Beneath the surface, within chambers yet to be fully unearthed, archaeologists find fragments of bone, brittle, pale, scattered like seeds. They are not animal remains, they are human. For decades, these bones were dismissed as the accidental remnants of burial erosion or natural deposition. But under closer examination, something remarkable emerged. A few of the skull fragments bore drilled holes, cut marks, and fine scratches. Not random damage, deliberate modification. Someone had carved into the dead. Across the ancient Near East, from Jericho to Ain Ghazal, the same phenomenon appears. Skulls separated from bodies, flesh removed, faces remade in clay or plaster. Scholars call it the cult of the skull, a practice older than civilization, older even than farming itself. At Göbekli Tepe, we may be seeing its first incarnation. In one of the lower levels, a fragment of cranium was found with 3 parallel holes bored neatly into its crown. The bone had been painted red with ochre. Another bore signs of having been suspended, perhaps hung from a pillar or worn during a ceremony. Schmidt speculated that the skulls of ancestors may have been displayed here, glimmering in torchlight, presiding over rituals of renewal. The people who built Göbekli Tepe lived in a world where the boundary between life and death was porous. To them, the dead were not gone. They were guardians, witnesses, perhaps even participants in the sacred gatherings. Their skulls, polished and decorated, might have been conduits, vessels through which the living spoke to the past. In the same strata, archaeologists uncovered tiny stone bowls and carved basins. Some were stained dark by residue, later identified as a mixture of blood and ochre. Others bore shallow grooves that might once have guided liquid offerings down the pillar bases into the earth. Perhaps each circle of pillars was a stage for a cycle of communion, the earth receiving its own memory back, drop by drop. Not all the human remains show reverence. A handful bear marks of decapitation and defleshing, clean and intentional. Some researchers believe these were acts of violence, trophies of war, but there is no evidence of fortifications, no weapons beyond flint tools, no mass graves of conflict. So what if it was something else? Not murder, but ritual separation. A symbolic act, freeing the head, the seat of consciousness, to join the ancestral pantheon. In the mythology of later ages, echoes of this practice persist. In ancient Mesopotamia, gods create humans from the blood and clay of a slain deity. In Sumer, the word for life and breath share the same root as wind. The skull, once emptied of breath, becomes a vessel waiting to be filled again. When Schmidt first held a fragment of human bone from Göbekli Tepe, he wrote in his field notes, "They did not fear death, they conversed with it." The concept of ancestor worship may have begun here, at the dawn of memory. The dead were not to be hidden but displayed. Incorporated into architecture, literally embedded into the sacred. To build a temple, they built around their dead. Consider Pillar 18 in Enclosure D, the most prominent of all. On its surface, two arms are carved down its sides, the hands clasped in front. It is a human shape, monumental and faceless. If, as some propose, each pillar represented an ancestor or shaman transformed into stone, then Göbekli Tepe itself is a congregation of the dead, a circle of petrified forebears. And among them perhaps hung the real skulls of their kin, swaying gently in the smoke of the fires. The deeper implications are haunting. If the builders of Göbekli Tepe truly believed they could speak to the dead or become them, then religion may have been born not from fear of death, but from a longing to preserve memory beyond the body. In a world without writing, the only way to remember someone forever was to turn them into something that would not decay. Stone. This act, carving, erecting, venerating, was humanity's first resistance against forgetting. Göbekli Tepe was not a temple to gods, it was a machine of remembrance. Yet even remembrance has its shadows. At nearby Chayonu, archaeologists discovered an altar covered in what appeared to be dried human blood. The possibility of ritual sacrifice cannot be ignored. If Göbekli Tepe shared this culture, then the line between reverence and offering might have been thin. Perhaps some skulls were ancestors, others sacrifices. The boundary between devotion and dread, between communion and consumption, may have blurred long before history began to record it. And so we are left with an image both sacred and terrible, a circle of stone figures under the stars. Skulls suspended like lanterns, flames flickering on carvings of foxes and serpents, a people speaking softly to those who no longer breathe, asking them to remember what the living could not yet write. As the first light of dawn spills over the Taurus Mountains, the hill grows quiet again. The bones sleep. The whispers fade. Only the stones remain, listening. But somewhere, beneath the dust and centuries, the next layer of the mystery awaits. A world reshaped by fire, water, and ice, and a climate that would test the very survival of the builders themselves. 12,000 years ago, the earth trembled with change. The great ice sheets that had ruled the north for millennia were dying, their edges collapsing into torrents that carved new rivers through the land. Across Eurasia, seas rose, forests advanced, deserts shrank, and animals that had once roamed in endless herds began to vanish. The world the builders of Göbekli Tepe inherited was not merely warming, it was transforming. This was the end of the Younger Dryas, the last cold gasp of the Ice Age. For nearly 1,000 years, temperatures had plummeted without warning, forcing humanity into isolation and survival. Then around 9,600 BC, the ice released its grip. Within a handful of generations, climate swung from glacial to fertile, from frozen wasteland to meadow and forest. To those who lived through it, this must have felt like resurrection, a second creation. In that green dawn, the southern foothills of the Taurus Mountains became a cradle of abundance. Wild wheat and barley grew in the valleys. Pistachio and almond trees lined the slopes. Herds of gazelle and aurochs moved through the plains, their migrations returning with predictable rhythm. For the first time in tens of thousands of years, humans could depend on the land. And yet, with abundance came a new anxiety. To survive scarcity is simple. One must move. To survive abundance is harder. One must stay. At the very moment the world became generous, humanity began to change. Not by necessity, but by choice. They gathered around certain hills, certain springs, certain places where they felt the pulse of something eternal. Göbekli Tepe was one of these. It is no coincidence that its earliest layers date precisely to this transition, around 9,600 BC, the same horizon at which the Younger Dryas ended. The builders were witnesses to planetary rebirth. The rising fertility of the land may have inspired the first organized rituals of gratitude and fear, festivals to honor the forces that had thawed the world, and sacrifices to ensure they would not turn cold again. When we look at the carvings of vultures and serpents, we see mythology, but they may also record memory. Some scientists believe the vulture stone, Pillar 43, might preserve an account of the cataclysm itself, perhaps a comet or meteor impact that marked the end of the Ice Age. Others, more cautious, see only a sky map, constellations fixed in limestone to remember a moment when heaven itself changed. Either way, Göbekli Tepe was born of transition, an architecture of remembrance erected in the first stable climate humans had ever known. Ice core samples from Greenland tell the same story in frozen language. A sudden 10 degrees C warming, a spike in carbon, the beginning of a new epoch. Rivers that had been locked in ice for 10,000 years began to flow again, carrying silt and seeds, and perhaps myths. Those who built the stone circles lived in a world of movement, migrating herds, blooming plants, rivers finding new paths. Their lives depended on reading those patterns. To track seasons, they needed the sky. To remember the sky, they needed a monument. Göbekli Tepe may have been that monument, a calendar of stone marking the first equilibrium between chaos and order. Within its walls, the carvings form recurring pairs, predator and prey, serpent and bird, chaos and balance. The same dualities mirrored the world around them. The thaw had given life, but it had also unleashed floods and storms. Perhaps the pillars were erected as intermediaries, stone guardians to hold back the returning dark. In that light, the temple was not merely a shrine, it was a contract. Humanity had begun to negotiate with nature. The rituals that unfolded here may have reflected the rhythm of the new year, the cycle of migration, harvest, death, and rebirth. The people who gathered at Göbekli Tepe were not farmers yet, but they were learning the patience of one, marking time, forecasting the seasons, invoking continuity. In the soil around the enclosures, archaeologists found remains of wild barley, einkorn wheat and almonds, the same species that would later be domesticated. The leap from foraging to farming was already stirring in the human mind. Perhaps the rituals themselves taught it, the observation that life could be renewed through care, repetition and timing. It is here, on this hill, that humanity's relationship with the earth changed forever. Before, nature ruled man. After, man sought to rule nature. But before dominion came awe. Imagine standing in the twilight of the Younger Dryas, the cold wind dying, the air warming, the stars unfamiliar. To the hunters of Göbekli Tepe, the world itself must have seemed alive, a being awakening after long sleep. The building of the temple may have been an act of devotion to that awakening, the earth reborn, the heavens reordered, and humanity standing between them, unsure whether to celebrate or fear. Klaus Schmidt once wrote that Göbekli Tepe was the first cathedral on earth, and its roof was the sky. He may have meant that literally. The builders did not seek shelter, they built exposure, an open sanctuary beneath the cosmos, a place to face the vastness without walls. And in that open air, amid the hum of insects and the cry of cranes, they may have felt the same realization that every civilization would echo afterward. We are small. The world changes without asking, and yet we can mark the change in stone. As the Ice Age melted away, so too did the simplicity of human life. In the warmth that followed, the seeds of permanence were sown, seeds that would become agriculture, cities, kings and gods. But before any of that, there was this hill, this circle of stone, this moment when humanity looked at the thawing earth and said, "Thank you." And just as quickly, perhaps, "Don't leave us again." The next shift would not come from the heavens or the ice, but from within the human mind itself. A transformation even greater than climate, the birth of belief. The story of civilization is often told as a tale of tools, of seeds planted, fires tamed, metals forged. But Göbekli Tepe suggests a different beginning, not technological, but psychological. The temple came before the village, the idea before the tool. What stirred in those hunter-gatherers that led them to carve gods from stone? What transformed wandering tribes into builders of sacred geometry? In 2001, a French archaeologist named Jacques Cauvin proposed a radical answer. Civilization, he argued, did not begin with agriculture, it began with belief. In his book, The Birth of the Gods and the Origins of Agriculture, he wrote, "Before man transformed the world, he transformed his own mind." It was not the invention of farming that created religion, it was the birth of symbolic thought, of myth, that made farming possible. Göbekli Tepe may be the earliest evidence of that revolution in consciousness. The people who built it had already stepped across an invisible threshold. They no longer saw themselves merely as part of nature, but as partners with it, capable of asking, pleading, shaping. When they raised their monoliths toward the heavens, they were doing more than honoring the world. They were asserting connection, an awareness of unseen order. To understand this shift, we must look not to artifacts, but to imagination. The carvings at Göbekli Tepe are filled with duality, predator and prey, life and death, sky and underworld. This patterning reflects something new, abstract thought. For the first time, humans weren't just responding to their environment, they were interpreting it. The pillars became metaphors, the animals, symbols. That act, seeing meaning beyond the literal, is the seed of civilization. Archaeologists often describe this as the cognitive leap of the late Pleistocene, the moment humanity became fully self-aware. But at Göbekli Tepe, that awareness is no longer inward. It's externalized in architecture. The mind has taken form. The very structure of the temple mirrors the human psyche. At the center of each enclosure stand two immense T-shaped pillars, twin beings facing each other, like hemispheres of a brain. Around them, smaller pillars form a circle, as though orbiting a central consciousness. Stone has become thought made solid. Schmidt once remarked that walking into the central chamber felt like standing inside a mind turned outward. Vital. Perhaps that was its purpose, to make visible the invisible, memory, belief, or the unseen machinery that would soon build empires. At the edge of one enclosure, archaeologists discovered a rare artifact, a limestone headless figure clutching a serpent. The pose is tense, almost defiant. It could represent mastery over chaos, the triumph of understanding over fear. In the myths that would follow millennia later, the same image returns. Gilgamesh taming beasts, the serpent in Eden, the slaying of cosmic dragons, all echoes perhaps of an idea first born here, that knowledge itself is sacred. Göbekli Tepe reveals something profound, the first glimmer of metaphor as technology. When people believed that ritual could influence the natural world, it gave them a reason to plan, to cooperate, to endure. From ritual came repetition, from repetition came cultivation. Belief was the prototype of the plough. Around the site, remains of wild einkorn wheat show traces of genetic selection, the earliest sign of human influence on nature's code. Not full domestication, but the first spark of control. The builders who carved gods were already experimenting with the earth. But control has a cost. To carve a god is to create a hierarchy between maker and made, between those who speak to the divine and those who listen. Somewhere in that hierarchy, power was born. What began as shared awe could have evolved into authority. The first priests may have been shamans, intermediaries between the seen and unseen, but soon that power to interpret became power to command. At Göbekli Tepe, we glimpse the moment when cooperation began to bend towards structure, when myth became management. The act of organizing hundreds to raise pillars required leadership, persuasion, perhaps even ritual obligation. Religion, in its infancy, was a form of coordination. And yet, for all its sophistication, this was still a world without ownership. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were not yet farmers guarding fields. They were still hunters, their wealth measured in relationships, not land. Their religion bound them not to property, but to one another, and to the forces they could neither explain nor escape. It's a haunting paradox. The same mental revolution that made us builders also made us restless. Once we could imagine perfection, the world as it was could no longer satisfy us. By raising their first temple, humanity also raised its first question. What comes after the sacred moment ends? Perhaps that's why, after centuries of use, they chose to bury Göbekli Tepe under tons of earth, not to destroy it, but to preserve it. The temple may have marked the transition from pure vision to practical life, from imagining the world to reshaping it. When they covered the stones, maybe they were saying farewell to something irreplaceable, the innocence of a mind that worshipped before it worked. The plough would come soon after, and with it, fields, surplus, kings, and writing. But the dream that began here, the dream that consciousness could shape reality, would never end. As the wind curls over the hill and night gathers once more, the pillars stand as silent neurons of that awakening mind, still connected, still humming. Next comes the deeper layer of inheritance, the memory of art, fire, and imagination carried from Ice Age caves into this newborn world. The story of humanity's first cathedral is not just about where belief began, but how far back it truly reaches. Long before Göbekli Tepe rose from the Anatolian earth, there were other sanctuaries, not of stone, but of shadow and fire. Deep beneath the limestone ridges of Europe, humans had already painted the walls of the world. In caves like Chauvet, Altamira, and Lascaux, the walls still shimmer with movement, lions chasing bison, horses galloping through flickering light, hands pressed like signatures from another age. These paintings are more than art. They are thought made visible, the earliest record of the human imagination. 40,000 years before Göbekli Tepe, someone mixed ochre and charcoal and said, "Let us remember this." The first architects, it seems, were painters, and what they painted were not just animals, but relationships. Between predator and prey, night and day, man and the unseen. Those same relationships would later be carved, vast and enduring, into the pillars of Göbekli Tepe. If the cave was the womb of art, Göbekli Tepe was its rebirth under the open sky. Anthropologists call this continuity the mythic thread, a lineage of symbolic expressions stretching unbroken across tens of millennia. In the Ice Age world, people already gathered for ritual. They sang, they danced, they painted. The earliest musical instruments, bone flutes from Swabian Germany, date back to 40,000 BC. The first sculptures, the so-called Venus figurines of Europe and Siberia, depict rounded human forms carved from ivory or clay. Some show deliberate facial deformation, others the absence of a face entirely, echoing the faceless gods of Göbekli Tepe. In both cases, humanity created something greater than itself, and then bowed before it. By the time the last ice age began to fade, around 20,000 BC, symbolic complexity had spread from the caves of Europe to the open plains of Eurasia. In the frozen steppes of what is now Ukraine, the mammoth bone huts of Mythic formed circles of colossal ribs and tusks, meticulously arranged. Within them, archaeologists found beads, carvings, and traces of ochre. These were not mere shelters. They were ceremonial spaces, temples made of bone. We can trace the same impulse eastward to Siberia, where the Malta-Burets culture carved birdmen, hybrid creatures, and women wrapped in cloaks, figures that blur the line between human and divine. The people of the Ice Age were already weaving myth into matter. When viewed through this lens, Göbekli Tepe is not a beginning, but a culmination, the last great expression of an idea that had been evolving since the first handprint appeared on a cave wall. And yet, something changed in its translation from pigment to stone. In the caves, art was hidden, secret, accessible only by torchlight. At Göbekli Tepe, art became public, monumental, carved for the heavens to see. Humanity had turned its private visions outward. Perhaps this was the true revolution, the moment when imagination ceased to belong only to the few and became a shared architecture of faith. Consider the figures at Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, a cluster of small fired clay sculptures dating to 25,000 BC. Among them, a distorted female face, perhaps representing an elder or shaman, was found beside the bones of foxes. The combination, woman and animal, mirrors the same symbolic union carved into Göbekli Tepe's pillars. Human bodies bearing animal forms, boundaries dissolved. Across these ancient horizons, one theme recurs again and again: transformation. The artists of the Ice Age were obsessed with it. Animals turning into people, people into spirits, spirits into stars. In their world, identity was fluid, shifting with season and song. The builders of Göbekli Tepe inherited that same fluidity, but made it permanent. They carved transformation itself into limestone. Imagine the lineage: a Paleolithic shaman in a cave, tracing a running deer in ochre; a Neolithic craftsman in Anatolia, chiseling the same deer into stone, separated by 30,000 years, united by a single gesture of remembrance. This continuity suggests that humanity's first temples were not sudden miracles of genius. They were accumulations of memory, each generation adding another layer to the mythology of the world. Göbekli Tepe was the last verse of an Ice Age song, the final echo of a consciousness that still believed the sacred was woven through every living thing. Even the choice of location, high on a ridge, visible for miles, recalls the caves placed in remote liminal spaces. Both are thresholds between realms, the underworld and the sky. In the cave, one descended to meet the spirits. On the hill, one ascended. The direction changed, the purpose did not. As the Ice Age receded, humans carried their memories upward, out of the dark into daylight. Göbekli Tepe was the sunrise of art, a translation of shadow into stone, of flickering firelight into eternal form. But every dawn casts a shadow of its own. To carve the sacred into permanence is also to fix it, to freeze it in time. The fluid visions of the Ice Age became laws of the Neolithic. Where once myth was improvisation, it now demanded structure, order, hierarchy. Perhaps that is the paradox of human progress. The more we remember, the less we can change. Still, the echoes persist. When modern archaeologists step into those ancient caves or walk the circles of Göbekli Tepe, they feel the same chill, the sensation that the walls themselves are watching, the same resonance between art and awe, separated only by the thickness of time. And it is through these echoes that we begin to understand what the builders of Göbekli Tepe truly inherited, not technology, but imagination itself. The next evolution would bring that imagination out of art and into society, into feast, cooperation, and power. What began as shared wonder would soon become the architecture of order. Night again on the hill. The wind carries the scent of ash. In the half-moon glow, stone bowls and bone tools lie scattered around the ancient floor, remains of feasts that ended 12,000 years ago. When the bones of Göbekli Tepe's animals were first examined, gazelle, boar, aurochs, wild cattle, the pattern was unmistakable. Thousands upon thousands of them, shattered and burned, all gathered in specific layers. The conclusion was unavoidable. The temple was a place of massive gatherings. But these were not the quiet prayers of monks. They were festivals. Imagine it. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, converging from the plains and valleys once each year, bringing food, water, skins, and stories. Fires blazing, drums echoing through the night. Feasts that lasted for days. It is here that the archaeologists began to glimpse something new, the first evidence of organized celebration in human history. The stones, once thought to mark the birth of religion, may also mark the birth of community itself. In the animal remains, researchers found a consistent signature, an over-representation of gazelle, slaughtered in their prime, their bones split for marrow. Nearby, stone troughs and vats large enough to brew hundreds of litres of liquid. Chemical traces inside revealed residues of barley fermentation, the world's earliest evidence of beer. If the builders of Göbekli Tepe were the first priests, they were also the first brewers. Feasting, as anthropologists like Brian Hayden later argued, may have been the glue of early society, not an indulgence, but a necessity. To build a temple required cooperation on an unprecedented scale. To sustain that cooperation, something had to unite people beyond survival. Food, music, and ritual did what weapons could not. They turned strangers into allies. In these feasts, we can see the first faint outline of hierarchy. Someone had to organize the hunt, to distribute the meat, to conduct the ceremonies. Someone led, others followed. The sacred meal became a structure, and from structure, power was born. Göbekli Tepe was not a city, yet it pulsed like one during these gatherings. Each enclosure may have been associated with a different clan, its carvings marking the spirit animals of that tribe. Fox, crane, snake, vulture. The act of carving was likely ceremonial, performed together while the feast roared outside. The evidence suggests that each temple was built in a single burst of effort, hundreds working in unison for weeks, then leaving it behind, sealed, their purpose complete. This rhythm of construction and abandonment mirrors the very nature of early ritual: build, worship, bury, repeat. What kind of society could sustain this? Perhaps none in the modern sense. These were still nomads, yet the shared project of monument building transformed them into something more. an ideological network spread across the Taurus foothills, connected not by roads or kings, but by story and feast. This pattern repeats across time and continent. Thousands of years later, in the Andes, at Caral and Chavindehuantar, archaeologists would find the same signs. Communal feasts, ritual architecture, no evidence of warfare. It seems the earlier civilizations were not built on conquest, but on communion. Still, hierarchy was quietly fermenting, like the beer in those limestone vats. Ritual requires specialists, the one who chants, the one who knows when to begin, the one who speaks for the gods. The shaman became priest, the priest became organizer, the organizer became leader. In every age that followed, that pattern would repeat. Göbekli Tepe may therefore represent not just the dawn of religion, but the seed of authority. The moment humanity learned that belief could direct labor, that myth could move stone. Yet for the people who gathered here, it may not have felt like subjugation. It was transcendence, the ecstasy of belonging to something larger than oneself. The smoke, the music, the rhythm of shared effort, these were the first tools of civilization. One can almost hear it, the low hum of voices chanting, hands clapping on stretched hides, sparks rising into a violet sky. The central pillars glowing orange in firelight, animal carvings flickering as if alive. And in that collective trance, a realization taking hold, that through unity they could reshape the world. Perhaps that realization was intoxicating in more ways than one. The beer may have been a sacrament, a shared elixir that blurred the line between ritual and joy. Archaeologists at the nearby site of Karahan Tepe have uncovered similar basins, suggesting the entire region participated in this sacred intoxication. In every sense, Göbekli Tepe was a crucible, not only of stone, but of mind and society. For the first time, people were staying in one place long enough to imagine permanence. The same cooperation that raised pillars would soon turn to tending fields, domesticating animals, building homes. Feasting became farming, celebration became settlement, ritual became routine. And yet, there is a subtle melancholy in this transition. In coming together, humanity found its strength, but also its burden. What had begun as festival would one day become obligation. The stones that once gathered joy would one day anchor empires. The builders could not have known this. To them, the pillars were still alive, radiant with meaning, resonant with song. When the fires burned low and dawn began to break, the feasts would end. The hunters would scatter back into the hills, leaving their sacred work behind, sealed in silence. And perhaps when they returned the following year, they would see their monuments half buried by dust and grass, already ancient, already forgotten, and they would build again. Göbekli Tepe was a rhythm more than a place, a heartbeat between survival and civilization. But rhythms can end, and one day, perhaps without realizing it, they carved their last pillar, drank their last ceremonial brew, and began the long descent into permanence. Villages, fields, ownership, hierarchy. The temple that had united them would soon be buried by their own hands. The hill was never meant to last forever. By the time the final enclosures stood, the people who had built them were changing. The old ways, the endless migrations, the sky-watching rituals, the feasts of the hunt, were fading into memory. And so, one day, they began to bury what they had once raised. It was not collapse, not disaster. It was decision. Around 8200 BC, long before kings or calendars, the builders of Göbekli Tepe performed one of the strangest acts in human history. They entombed their own creation. Layer upon layer, they filled the sacred circles with debris, limestone fragments, animal bones, flint tools, soil brought from the plains below. Each chamber was sealed with precision, as if following a ceremonial blueprint. Archaeologists call it a backfilling event, but the term feels lifeless beside the intent that shaped it. The burial was not neglect, it was a ritual closing. Every gesture of construction was repeated in reverse. The gods returned to the earth, the circle sealed, the story complete. When it was done, the hill that once blazed with firelight and song lay silent again. For the first time in centuries, the wind had the place to itself. Why would a people devote generations to building a temple only to bury it? Perhaps because they had become something new. The world around them was changing. The climate shifted abruptly, the event modern scientists call the 8.2 kilo-year cooling. Rain patterns faltered, rivers shrank, the green horizon retreated. For communities already experimenting with wild grains and herding, such change could fracture everything. When food failed, perhaps faith was questioned. Maybe the gods fell silent. Maybe the temple that once bound them together became a reminder of what was lost. And yet the burial does not feel like despair. There is no sign of violence, no destruction, no haste. The enclosures were sealed with care, like tombs prepared for eternity. The very act of covering them may have been a final offering, an acknowledgement that the world they once knew had run its course. As settlements appeared farther down the Euphrates, people began to stay in one place. The rhythm of the hunt became the rhythm of the harvest. The temple that once united nomads no longer belonged to this new life. To live in permanence, the old wandering gods had to sleep. So they laid them to rest, not destroyed, but folded into the earth. It was a gesture of reverence, not rejection, a covenant between the past and what was coming. Centuries later, when Schmidt's team unearthed the first pillars, their carvings were astonishingly intact. The limestone sharp, the reliefs unweathered, the foxes and cranes still alive in shadow. That is the paradox of burial. By concealing, they preserved. They did not erase their temple. They protected it from time itself. Perhaps they knew the land would remember. Perhaps the burial was not an end but a message. The pattern of backfilling repeated again and again, enclosure after enclosure, each smaller and simpler than the one before. The sequence tells a quiet story, craftsmanship declining as generations passed, precision giving way to memory. Göbekli Tepe, it seems, did not fall. It faded. The people who raised the last pillars no longer remembered the full meaning of what they built. They were copying echoes, shapes without context, still sacred, but dimmed. That fading is the purest form of forgetting, not the loss of knowledge, but the ritual of repetition when meaning has slipped away. And perhaps that is what civilization is, the long memory of actions whose purpose we no longer recall. Archaeologists have traced the lineage that followed. Within centuries of Göbekli Tepe's final burial, new communities emerged along the rivers. Tsayonu, Çatalhöyük, Ain Ghazal. Their walls were painted, their dead buried beneath floors, their art alive with bulls' heads and vultures, all echoes of the same symbols once carved into the stones of the hill. The spirit of Göbekli Tepe had not died, it had migrated. The builders' descendants were now farmers. But when they shaped clay, they still traced the same gestures once cut in stone. The animals that had been gods became guardians of fertility, protectors of harvests. The temple had transformed into the household, the sacred made domestic. It is tempting to see the burial as a tragedy, as if an ancient light went out. But look closer. Every civilization begins by closing the door on something older. The burial of Göbekli Tepe may have been humanity's first act of historical awareness, the recognition that memory itself can be crafted, shaped, and sealed. To bury the sacred is to decide what will endure. It is the first step in learning to control the past. That is what sets Göbekli Tepe apart. It is not only the first temple, it is the first archive, a deliberate preservation of belief. Each stone, each fill of rubble, a line in a message written for those who would come after. And 10,000 years later, when Schmidt brushed the soil from a carved vulture's wing, the message was answered. The past had waited long enough. When archaeologists reopened the hill, they were not merely excavating ruins, they were reopening a decision. The hands that buried these stones had done so, knowing that one day someone would find them, that we would stand here, reading their silence, trying to translate what they chose to conceal. In that sense, Göbekli Tepe's burial was the beginning of something vast, the first collaboration across millennia. Builders and excavators, joined by time, speaking through dust. At sunset, the limestone glows the colour of parchment. The wind carries sand across the rings, scattering it like the turning of pages. Somewhere below, untouched chambers still lie waiting, their carvings unseen since the day they were sealed. There is no sorrow in that darkness, only patience. The hill does not mourn what was lost. It remembers, and in remembering, it becomes eternal. What happens to a world once it is buried? When faith is sealed beneath the earth, does it die, or does it begin again in another form? The silence left by Göbekli Tepe was not the end of its story. It was the beginning of its afterlife. Out of that silence, myth began to grow, first as whispers of a sacred mound where the gods once walked, then as memories of creation itself. By the time writing was invented 5,000 years later, whispers of a sacred mountain at the world's edge had already entered myth. The Sumerians called it Duku, the Holy Mound, home of the earliest gods. The Anunna, those who existed before heaven and earth, were divided. It was said to be a place where the first offerings were made, where the gods themselves descended to walk among men. Its name means the mound that gave birth. Adechung. Göbekli Tepe means much the same, the pot-bellied hill, the pregnant earth. Could this mythic mountain be a memory of the same sacred landscape? The question lingers like incense, impossible to prove, impossible to forget. Even as civilization blossomed, in Uruk, in Egypt, in the Indus Valley, the image of the sacred mound endured. Ziggurats, pyramids, and temples rose across continents, each echoing the same design. A mountain built by human hands ascending toward the sky. Every civilization seems to remember the same dream, that between heaven and earth stands a stairway, a place where creation began. At Göbekli Tepe, that stairway was horizontal, circular, spiraling inward rather than upward. But the impulse is the same, to bring order to the cosmos by giving it form. The later ziggurats of Mesopotamia and the step pyramids of Egypt may not have copied Göbekli Tepe directly, yet they carried its essence, the translation of faith into architecture. Time folds strangely when we look backward. The gods of stone became the gods of clay tablets. The rituals of hunters became the rites of kings. And the hill that once hosted wild feasts became the silent prototype of civilization itself. Klaus Schmidt often stood here in the evenings, gazing west toward the Taurus Mountains, wondering how far those echoes reached. He believed that Göbekli Tepe was not an origin, but a bridge, between the world of hunters and the world of cities, between the fluid spirituality of the Ice Age and the organized worship of the Neolithic. He died in 2014, his life's work unfinished. But the excavation continues, each season peeling back another layer of time. New sister sites, Karahan Tepe, Sefer Tepe, Tashella Tepe, reveal that Göbekli Tepe was part of a vast network, the Stone Hills culture, stretching for hundreds of kilometers. Each one a verse in a greater story, a forgotten civilization of temples without cities. When we look across this network today, one realization emerges. Humanity did not build its first temples to serve gods. It built them to remember, to give permanence to the fleeting, and that desire, more than hunger or conquest, is what truly defines civilization. Every pillar, every carving, every deliberate burial is an act of defiance against forgetting. The builders of Göbekli Tepe could not have imagined satellites or museums, but they understood time. They understood that memory fades unless anchored in stone. Perhaps that is why the same impulse recurs in every age: the pyramids, the Parthenon, the cathedrals, the observatories, each one a monument to the same ancient longing, to speak across the abyss of time, to be heard by those who come after. And now, as archaeologists brush dust from the carvings of foxes and cranes, we are the listeners. We have become the inheritors of that conversation. The pillars stand in their protective shelter, once more exposed to the wind, each a word in a language we are still learning to translate. When light shifts at dusk, shadows fall across their carved arms, and for a moment they seem almost human, as if the old guardians are watching us watch them. Perhaps they are. Perhaps memory itself is the oldest god. From the vantage of this hill, the plains stretch endlessly southward, toward Harran, toward ancient Ur, toward the lands where the first written myths would emerge. Somewhere out there, the descendants of Göbekli Tepe's builders would plant their first crops, build their first houses, and carve their own gods from clay. But the pattern began here, beneath this soil, beneath this silence. The sky darkens, stars bloom. Once again, the constellations look down on the same ridge they saw 12,000 years ago. The same wind moves over the stones, whispering through cracks, tracing the same invisible patterns. Time has not erased Göbekli Tepe. It has only folded it into the memory of the world. The first temple, the last echo of the wild mind, the mountain where humanity learned to remember itself. Before you leave this story behind, take a moment to help it live a little longer. Like this video if you want more journeys into the ancient unknown. Subscribe if you wish to keep uncovering the hidden origins of our world. Share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Göbekli Tepe was the beginning of civilization, or the memory of one that came before? Your voice adds another layer to the story, and perhaps one day someone will uncover it too.